Well, good evening, everybody. Happy Tuesday story time. That's right, it's another Tuesday, and time for another chapter of The Hammer of the Sun by Michael Scott Rohan. Well, let's talk a little bit about what happened last week. So last week, Elof managed to complete his escape from the island. He, had his wings strapped on. He flew all the way back out to the High Gate. He met up with Rock and the sailors that he had met earlier in his travels. They stole a boat and made good their escape from the ancient land of Karis. Fleeing the Ekwesh and a gigantic ass dragon who, were going to try to stop them, but didn't. They didn't manage to do so. So they made their way back to the west and met back up with Kermorven and company and have explained what was going on. And now the plan is ideally to make their way back to the land of Karis with all the ships and sailing folk and all of the above from the west to try to stop Lohi in her plans to take over the ancient land of Karis and make good her return of essentially an ice age taking over the world. And that is where we'll start into Chapter 10 this week. So sit back, everybody, and relax. Of course, this is not only on my Twitch channel, it is on my YouTube channel live right now, youtube.com/@SirArminius. You can also get out there and listen to any of the previous chapters from The Hammer of the Sun, as well as the original two books of the trilogy, The Anvil of Ice and The Forge in the Forest, all available on my YouTube channel. If you like it, feel free to give it a subscribe, give a like to any of those videos, comment, do whatever makes you happy, helping to grow that additional channel of my streaming platform. Help me to become that additional bit of voice actor. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 10. The Shield Wall Breaks. The wind blows fair across the wide sea. My black-haired girl, it takes from me. Sorrow, you winds above, sigh for me and my love. You western girl, ah, you black-haired girl, you wild lover of mine. The voice came echoing eerily down through the gloom from the masthead above, chanting in time to the slow splash of the sweeps. Whichever young sailor it was had a fine voice, but it ground upon Elof's nerves like the wail of a pent-up dog. He shifted uncomfortably where he sat, hunched up against the high stern post, but only made himself more uncomfortable. His life had left his body a mass of scars, and in this damp weather it seemed that every single separate one of them grew taut and ached. The scars around the silver rings had even begun to bleed a little. But Kermorven was not the kind of man to countenance silencing the singer for so petty a reason. Nor, he had to face it, was he himself. Besides, it helped keep the ships together. He pulled his cowl over his head and rested his head upon his knees. But because he had to support them with his arms, it was hardly restful. Just as he gave up and resolved to enjoy the song, it broke off abruptly and became a shout. "Dawn ho!" The order was given to dim the lanthorns, and looking where he knew the east must be, Elof became aware of a trace of light, pallid and sourceless, spreading like thin milk. "Not before time," said Kermorven, watching his officers scurrying about, seeking the sun with their navigation devices. "Between playing ducks and drakes with ice islands and striving to keep the fleet together, we're losing track of where we are." "Somewhere close," said Elof. "I feel it. In my bones, in my blood, I feel it." "A shame we cannot ask them for our heading," remarked the king wryly, shifting his fur cloak more firmly around him. "All mine can sense in this is this numbing, clammy chill. The very flesh will not shut it out. When I awoke this morning, my cabin was full of it. My mail shirt a mass of rime where it hung. And this is spring." "No," said Ilse grimly, from somewhere beside him. "This is still winter. A long winter. A winter of the world. Its cold fingers reach out even across the oceans now. How fares the land, I wonder?" "Dawn ho!" sang the lookout once again. "And the mists are clearing, wind arising, mists lifting." "What wind?" called Kermorven through his cupped hands. There was no reply for a moment. Elof bit his lip. Most probably it would be from the north, as usual, and bring down more ice among the fleet. It was a miracle they had lost no more than 2 ships so far, and no lives. A miracle, and Kermorven's keen planning and brilliant seamanship. "South wind, south and fair!" The mastheader's whoop of joy echoed from the deck, flowed naturally into song once more. "My sweetheart, pray the southern winds to speed me to you once more. Ah, smiling wind, blow stronger still, my girl lies lone ashore." But then all voices died away, for around them the fog seemed to heave and shrug like some vast indolent beast before rolling the deck. Behind it trailed a mass of serpentine streamers like ghostly banners, shredded and pale, through which they saw faint shapes gradually appear to left and right of them, their fellow ships, like rime-encrusted skeletons under their bare masts. But ahead of them, at the margins of sight, it was as if the mists grew solid, drew aside only to settle and condense on the rim of the world, becoming, as it seemed, a great jagged reef of whiteness rising straight out of the waters. High against a sky of sullen lead it towered, and glittered bright and cold. "Land ho!" sang the watcher. "Land!" But then his voice faltered. In face of that eerie mass, he could not be sure. "What is this?" exclaimed Kermorven in amazement. "Whole mountains of ice rising from the very sea itself? The glaciers cannot have come this far south already." "No," said Elof. rising awkwardly and shading his eyes with a hand. Nearest us, yes. Those are ice islands, fused almost into a ridge. But for all the snow that shrouds them, those are true hills behind. You look upon the eastern shores of the ocean, my lord, and if I mistake not, the coastlands of Caris itself. The end of our voyage is within sight. And the beginning of something more terrible, I doubt not, muttered Kermorven. Battle, war, slaughter, while the foes of life look on and laugh. But then his grim features softened with wonder, and he seized Elof's arm. Caris, he repeated. The shores of Caris. His blue-gray eyes glittered like the sea beneath. It is much to have come so far, to have looked upon them. He sighed, and then his mouth tightened again. However, we must reach them, and we cannot pass that ice wall. See how it curves away there to either side? Elof, could this be the bay of the gate ahead? And that be the wall you passed through in your escape? The grounded ice islands? Yes, breathed Elof. Yes, it could. So if we follow it north or south, we will come to land. South, if you please, smiled Kermorven grimly. Better we do not sail straight into the arms of the ice at once, but try to reach whatever endures of Caris first. Always assuming, he added, that we're allowed to reach the shore unmolested. The cry from the masthead cut like an arrow through his words. All yearning and all joy drained from the young voice, yielding place to urgency and alarm. A sail! Sail to landward! 2, 6, no, many sails! Black sails, a host of them! Running crosswind towards us! A bloody host! As I expected, said Kermorven calmly, amid all the frantic flurry on the deck around him. After the barriers, the picket forces. After the mist, the guard ships. The Lady Tauentar sets her sieges entirely in accordance with the old texts. She has not forgotten to provide against relief. The strange theft of a ship may have made her more alert, in which case she may also have some swift-moving reserves ready to reinforce the guards, for that too is laid down in the best authorities. Elof grinned, though he felt a sudden taut emptiness behind his belt. And what do they recommend to the relievers? Swiftness, and little else, save to avoid battle where possible, for delay can only bring down greater forces upon you. But it is too late for that now, I guess. You there, Oste, my armor! And rouse that slug-a-bed Rock while you're at it. Rock was on deck and clad in his mail before the guard ships came clearly into sight, though he grumbled about being roused. And all for a mere 30 reaver ships. I thought this fleet could pick its teeth with such numbers. There's not one of them the size of our Dromans or the Corentin, is there? Kermorven frowned. No, but they are all fair-sized ships, and heavily manned, by the look of them. They can afford to be, not carrying supplies. They'll fight the bloodiest delaying action they can, to win their kinsmen time either to bar us from landing, or fall on us while we are in the midst of it. I have ordered the dromons forward. Our best hope is to ram as many as possible and clear a passage through." Elof watched the black specks swell gradually against the forbidding walls of ice, finding it strange to think that only a year past he had sailed these waters beneath such a sail himself. They were moving out now into lines of battle, in staggered rows and spaced well apart to make them hard to ram. A shield of ships across the hidden land beyond. In just the same way, Kermorven's heaviest ships, the great man-carriers, were gliding up between the sleek warships in the van of the fleet, every inch of sail hoisted, every oar straining, to form a swift-moving spearhead shape. Spear would strike against shield. He shuddered at the thought. The collision would be bloody, costly, and he had had enough of such cost. The rams he himself had shaped hissed through the waters as if they were still their quenching trough, soaking in hides and offal to harden the steel. Would they grow any harder in the blood of men? He peered at the ships ahead, stark and clear in the pale light, striving to find some detail that would stop him thinking of them as faceless menaces. His hatred of the Eqesh, conceived in his first harsh captivity, had never left him. But as he peered at the ships ahead, stark and clear in the pale light, he could not forget that they were still crewed by men. It would be their blood, too. Suddenly, he stiffened, shaded his eyes, and strained to see. "What is it?" demanded Kermorven, who even among the pressures of command missed nothing. "You see something, man?" Elof rounded on him. "My lord, will you have the braziers made ready at once? And give the order for my wings." It was no answer, but Kermorven passed on the curt orders before he questioned Elof again, and that only with a sardonic eyebrow. Elof swallowed. "I can see, but I do not know if you can." The tall man stared a moment, his lips moving, and then gave vent to a very unkingly whistle. "Is that what you told me of? Louhi's swift reserves?" "It may well be. And if it is, then, as we agreed, it falls to me to meet it." "Alone?" cried Ilse. "That was never the plan. Use the new weapon." Rock echoed her, but Elof shook his head. You know better than that. Whatever you say. Once seen, it can be countered. We keep it for the last. Now help me arm." The braziers had been lit for the fog, and in the excitement, not yet extinguished. They were ready before Elof was. The steel lids clanged back, sending up a shower of little sparks. Kermorven and his officers jumped and looked blackly, for no mariner likes the least spark in the little world of timber and tar and tow around him. A ship is a world too easily ended. But the dark wings folded about them, and that embrace, no spark escaped. The least cinder that touched the deck was already dull and dead. One of the officers touched a spent brazier and gave a cry of surprise. "The very metal is cold." Elof smiled. "A man is no light weight to lift. Even with all that fire, I cannot stay aloft long. I must await the last moment." "It will not be long delayed," said Kermorven grimly, and with a gesture sent his archers swarming up the shrouds to the masthead, And we are almost within shot of the guard ships now. See? For the others it came too fast. But he had never quite taken his eyes off the enemy. A giant's hand seemed to slap the hull. Then something passed between sail and deck, making all in its path duck, and hissed over into the sea. The Correnton's bow catapults sang, but on the Dromond next to them, an invisible scythe slashed across the crowded deck, and cries arose. Kermorven, tight-lipped, was about to order the rowers to a last burst of speed when Elof caught his arm. "Wait," he said. "If I fail—" "If I wait, I risk more lives," grated the king. "Be swift, my friend, or do not venture it at all." There was a cry over their heads. A figure folded and dropped from the masthead, bounced off the mainyard, and dropped all asprawl to the deck. Elof swallowed, hoping it was not the singer, and flung his arms high above his head. With a rush and sweep, his wings unfolded across the stern castle. His maimed legs buckled, and he fell forward on their great beat. Over the deck he swooped, and up, half wild with relief and exhilaration, like a man who has lain months abed, able to walk again, to run free and unfettered. He climbed high to gain speed, and saw beneath him the masts of the fleet of Morvenhall, swaying like a floating forest out of the dispersing mists. It seemed to cover the sea, more than 300 ships strong, bearing well nigh 10,000 men. Yet against the 50,000 or more that Caris might field after centuries of war, or the unknown throngs of the Eqwesh and the unhuman servants of the ice, that number would be all too few. It might dwarf that dark phalanx ahead, a mere 30 ships. Yet against the threat that approached, it seemed nothing. Seeking an updraft, he swooped over the Eqwesh ships, and caught his breath as the white emblems on bow and flank came clear to him. They were all the same, following the patterns that iron custom had laid down. An upraised head, arrogant and crested, tongue erect to scream with laughter or contempt, its long beak gaping to grasp at the sun disk behind it. That changed everything. There was little time to waste, but he must risk it. He plunged straight towards the leading ship. He glimpsed an Eqwesh catapult shoot wide and targetless, skimming the harmless waves. They had seen him all right. Now let them hear. The leader was a dark hull longer than the rest, and it was careful to keep squarely in the path of the Prince Correnton's looming bow. They valued bravery, this folk, if little else. Above the leader's main deck, he pulled up sharply and came riding down the south wind, wings thrashing like a great black crow as the plowman passes. A hissing fountain of bolts and arrows rose up at him, but he hardly minded. He was hard to hit, and each one less at the fleet. Swiftly he cupped hands to mouth and cried out, in what he knew of the Eqwesh speech, "Clan of the Raven, warriors of the Cuchulainn, why bow you to shamans? Why grovel to the ice and she who rules it? Why do you counter the will of him you most revere?" No arrow was loosed, but among the uplifted faces, well nigh as dark as their leathern armor, there was a flurry of movement. Out onto the shaman's platform sprang a burly warrior, his white hair streaming in the downdraft. His cloak of marten furs billowed out amid a jangle of ornaments as he flung up an arm. Instinctively, Elof flinched, but only words were hurled. "Again you, steel shaman! Twice a hand count of years, and to the serpent's tongue you stole, you add the raven's wing. But are you truly his voice? Then let him shield you now. Or look to yourself, shaman, for behold, her hunter comes." It might have been thunder that came shivering down the airs, but Elof knew that it was not. Gorthar leaned into his hand. He flexed his shoulders and saw the black sail beaten aback against the mast by the gust that hurled him upward. Like a startled horse, the black ship reared and plunged. Then it shrank away beneath him. With a chill in his heart, he rose to meet the winged spear that came plunging down through the clouds. Immediately, he had seen that the speeding speck he had guessed the moment he and Kermorven had long debated was here. He had hoped it would be later, over land, with the bright sun at his back, the force of an army beneath him, and, hopefully, his latest and most powerful weapon. Now he was armed only with what he bore, and not for the first time he mourned the loss of helm and hammer. But late or soon, come it would. He had known that. As well, perhaps, that he face it now. To reach the Eqwesh, he had sacrificed height and speed. It was nearly the end of him. Those vast yellow eyes must have seen him even as he rose, so much greater than any seabird, and known him for an enemy and a challenge. That swoop was aimed not at the fleet, but at himself. Barely in time, he raised his left hand, open in defiance. Then the sky vanished around him, and suddenly he was back in his furnace, blinded and choking amid roaring flame. It was only agonized reflex that clenched his fists and dropped him just as suddenly into clear air once again, or as clear as it could be with a cloud of stinking, oily vapor about him. He knew then what had happened, and twisting about, he saw the brute circling, coming about to make another pass. But for a moment, he had the height, and as the broad back swept below him, he swooped in his turn and flung out his fist. Ahead of him, the mist cloud exploded about the muzzle of the great dragon as the heat the gauntlet had drained from it lanced back. Caught in the fireball, the long head was flung back, and the vast body, as long as any Dromund, curled and ducked away, wings folded, dropping towards the dark waters beneath. Elof cursed, and circled for height once more. He had hoped to kindle the beast's fire within its own throat, as he had served another once before. But this was an older, vaster creature, and undoubtedly wilier. It had shielded eye and muzzle and let the flame wash harmlessly over its scales, then sought to tempt him down by shamming defeat. Its wings unfolded suddenly, and the fall became a wide, sweeping glide well clear of the sea, away towards the advancing fleet. Elof cursed again, and ducked after it, as it knew he would have to. It was man-cunning, this creature, if not more. He had fallen into the snare of thinking it a beast, and now it was leading the fight. Abruptly, that serpentine body bent back on itself, and came lancing back at him as fast as it had fled a heartbeat since. The jaws opened, and in near panic, he thrust out his gauntlet to turn the flame. There was no flame. The gigantic jaws, long as a small boat and lined with teeth longer than his hands, twisted and snapped at him with a vicious speed he could not avoid. Barely in time, he swung his left arm clear, and in the same movement, hewed hard with Gorthar. Dark blood leaped into the air. The jaws clashed shut and twisted away. A bellow of pain and rage shivered the air around Elof, and the light was blotted out. In horror, he saw a vast leathery wing, dwarfing his own puny span, come sweeping down upon him like a toppling wall. In desperation, he struck again, a slashing blow taking all his strength from head to foot. A blow so hard that it spun him around in the air. A glancing impact stunned him, nearly tearing the blade from his hand. A spray of hot blood scorched his skin. A waft of foulness choked him, and another cry rang through his skull. No bellow, but a tearing shriek of pain and fury, whose sheer force struck him as hard as any blow and numbed his mind anew. "They'll hear that leagues hence," was his only clear thought as he tumbled down the airs. "Lohie'll know her pet's been stung." Then, once more at the margins of disaster, he half unconsciously spread his arms, and felt the wings bite the air above him and halt his fall. As the dragon had, he glided, letting the wind rush clear the pain in his head, and sought frantically about him for his antagonist. He had been helpless for minutes now. Why had the brute not finished him? Then, looking up, he saw the dragon plunge overhead, and realized what he had done. The giant wing was not, like his own, modeled after a bird's. It was a membrane of leathery skin stretched over bone, without feathers to part around an obstacle. His desperate slash had cut a way right through the membrane near the root, out to the trailing edge, so that only a loose shred had slapped at him, and with every wing beat that tear was spreading. He could guess at the pain of it, and the horror of losing control out over the dark ocean. Perhaps now the thing would turn back for the land. He had reckoned without the power of its wrath. The malign yellow eye fixed on him, and madness glazed it. Unable to fly freely, its mind clouded by anguish and fear, the great dragon opened its jaws and vomited a stream of flame upon its tormentor. Elof had just time to thrust up the gauntlet, but he might as well have sought to dam a river with it. The fire blast streamed about him and could not be extinguished, for that which the gauntlet cooled was lit anew. It was shielding his face and body a little, no more. It was not enough. Desperate once more, Elof flung his wings wide, his head back, and clenched his fist tight. At once the flame rushed in upon him, but it caught him full on his chest, as he had intended, and fell upon the gems of his corsetlet. These, too, could not stop such a rush of fire, but they did not need to. They drank deep of it before it touched Elof's flesh, and gave his wings such a surge of strength as they had never before received, save from the furnace that saw their birth. The force of their stroke hurled Elof free of the flame, but it did more. It lashed the fire stream back upon the dragon. and from below, beneath the edges of its shield-strong scales. Startled, the dragon plunged aside, or the wash of flame might have taken it full in the jaws. But its torn wing hampered it, and the fire struck it full on its right side, and spattered across its unprotected wing. The dragon shrieked, a high, thin, agonized note so loud it whipped the ears like a white-hot wire, as if to transmit the pain. Elof's head rang, his eyes stung, but as he climbed free, he saw the dragon drop away across the sky, trailing a great plume of smoke. The wind stank of scorched flesh. Its left wing shredded, its right perforated in many places and still ablaze. The creature was making a desperate lunge to reach the safety of the land and the cool snow-clad hills. What became of it, Elof never saw, but that it came to land is recorded, for its fall was seen, and the place of it noted, where a great fire sprang up among the snow. No doubt it was worse injured then, yet not slain, for a crawling trail led from that spot far off into the hills of the wildlands, and no man cared to follow further. What became of the dragon after that time is less certain, but that it lived on, maimed yet formidable, is beyond doubt. For even when its kind had withered in the changes of the world, it remained a legend of terror among the mountains of the ancient north long after the passing of these events and the closing of their chronicles. But Elof, riding a great surge of joy and relief, wheeled back on wings that throbbed with strength and hurled himself down upon the masts of the black flotilla beneath. And where the shadow of those wings passed, many a strong warrior flung himself face down upon the deck. He rejoiced at that, though there was no vainglory in him. He knew how close he had pressed his luck. But now, at least he could seek to save lives, rather than spill them. And for that, the Eqesh had to be impressed. He glanced quickly behind him, and saw to his relief that Morvenhall's strained sails had slackened their onrush, although they still advanced. He had the few minutes he needed. Again, he held the air above the bows of the chieftain's ship, and again he cried out to them. "It is well, then, sons of the Raven. Look to yourselves, you bade me, and that I have done. Now I bid you do as much. Ask this of yourselves. Will you follow her still, who would have you feast upon the flesh of men? Who sets you apart on the land, to walk the wastes and win no honor in war? Who sets you apart at sea, where you will strike the hardest against fellow followers of the Raven, where your deeds will be drowned in the sea's cold silence and forgotten? Who has bidden you throw your lives away, not for your own good reasons, but for hers?" Furiously he gestured at the oncoming fleet, at the inexorable glitter of the rams. "Then go. Go follow home her hunter, whom you bade me fear. Begone, ere she whips you in. Like curs to your kennels, leave the Raven banner to those who work his will." From the black ships came no word or sign, but neither was any weapon loosed or hand raised against Elof, though the very air grew taut as a bowstring. He could see the chieftain, standing by the helm, glancing slowly from Elof to the white-clad hills behind, and the hidden presence of the gate. Among these impassive folk, that probably betrayed a panic of indecision, but it was scarcely enough. It was one thing to claim the will of Raven, another to convince them. He had hoped to overawe them utterly, but at their best they were a fell folk, grim and dour, and the long service of the ice had hardened them to sights awesome and terrible. What else was left him, if even defeating the dragon had not served? He looked up despairingly to where the smoke of the battle still hung in the middle air, and thought for one awful moment that others had been sent out after him. But he saw at once that it was not so, and he laughed aloud for wonder. From out of the plume of smoke, as it spread and straggled upon the south wind, dropped the two specks that he had seen, circling, spiraling downward to settle in a flurry of wings as dark as his own upon either end of the black ship's mainyard. They snapped their high curved bills and cocked bright eyes down at the staring faces below. But then they peered back, cackling like malign old men over hunched shoulders, and stared straight at him. "Thinking," croaked the first. "Remembering," cackled the other, exactly as they had so many years since. He shivered with apprehension and the effort to understand. "Live, thrive, blood, brood," then "stay, pass, way," over and over, very fast, batting the words between each other like a game, till one suddenly added, "Choose." "Speak," spat the other, and rattled its black blade of a beak. Elof caught his breath. Then he threw back his head and laughed again as all his exultation flowed back to him, and shouted down to the silent ship below. "Behold, I ride upon black wings over land and sea. He has sped me to speak words of fire to you, words of sun's fire that shall shine through the pale ice and melt it to a mist. I am his emissary." He heard his words come rolling back like thunder from against the distant barriers of the ice. "Well, will you hear what he wills?" Not a boy stirred on the decks below. Even the sea seemed hushed. "You shall not fight, for the lives Louhi commanded you to cast away are not hers to rule, nor his, but yours alone. You need not surrender, nor bow the knee, nor in any way lessen your honor and your pride, but in the name of your mighty forefathers of old and their allegiance, older than the ice itself, he asks you to stand aside, to let pass the fleet before you, for they are also a part of the Raven's blood, sprung like you from the common blood of the fathers of men, that first he sheltered beneath his wing. Weigh well, choose freely. That is the Raven's word." Even as he finished, the black birds squawked and shrilled, rising on their cruel talons as they shook their wide wings. The chieftain looked up at them, and beyond to meet Elof's own intense gaze. For a moment they stared at one another, and at the black birds between them. Then the chief made a single curt gesture, spoke a short word, and the sharp-edged sweeps splashed into the water. The steersman bore down on his oar. In a swift flurry of wings, the two huge ravens flung themselves aloft, almost colliding with Elof and whirling him aside. When he collected himself, he saw that the dark ships were moving forward no longer, but turning away, aside. Numb with excitement, Elof came swooping down past the masthead of the Prince Corentin as it passed beneath him, and all but collapsed upon the deck. The shield split before the spearhead. If signals were exchanged, No man saw any, nor heard any hail, but the line of black ships parted, and peeled back on either side to give the great warship passage. In two long lines they formed up like sullen guards, and rode there, sails furled, silent watching the fleet pass. But as the last ship went by they hoisted sail once more, and the two ranks silently closed in behind it, and followed the fleet to land. On board the Corentin, confusion had reigned. Elof was bombarded with loud praise of his valor and wild inquiry as to what the savages meant, often in the same voices at the same time, till Kermorvan's dry voice cut through the hubbub and extracted an account of what had passed. "So, Raven takes an interest," mused Kermorvan, tapping the gold damask's raven and sun emblem on his breastplate. "He seems to think you did the right thing. And I agree. But I crave to know just what those ships intend now." Later that day, he found out. As the day declined, they sighted the southern hills still green and free of snow, and at their feet many small bays without any ice, that might make good anchorages. Kermorvan had the best of them swiftly sounded, then ordered the fleet in. He would waste no time, for, as he told Elof, Louhi's minions were probably herding a great army of Ekwesh southward across the snow that very minute, or preparing to land one from the sea. But the scouts he sent out, among them Elof aloft, reported both sea and land empty within their sight, and he gave the orders to disembark. It was a disciplined force that landed, but confusion and problems were inevitable. The land was cool and windswept under that grim and sunless sky, a country of barren cliffs and grassland only a little less harsh than the north had been. By the sea, tough grass and thorny gorse were all that grew, save for the odd stunted tree. Here and there in sheltered vales and hollows, some plants of warmer climes struggled on, but to no great effect. There was little to replenish their supplies, and no sign of men. But there was fresh water in plenty, and that they needed most. Their greatest concerns, as Kermorvan detailed them to the council of war he held on the Corentin's deck, were first, to establish and fortify their place of landing, and second, to seek a field for folk of Caris, and establish a link with them before Louhi's forces could cut across the land between. The matter of defenses Kermorvan set to Ilse and the small group of young Duergar she had brought, and even before the main body of the force was ashore, they were busy throwing up ditch and earthwork, complaining bitterly of the poor sandstone of the cliffs. Bearing a field posed a worse problem. On so long a voyage, they had not been able to bring many horses, and of those they had, some had died, and most were weakened by seasickness. Even Kermorvan's hardy white war horses, well used to sea voyages, were looking leaner in the ribs. Seasickness had taken its toll of men also, though they had guarded scrupulously against other disease, and many of the force were still not fit for long riding or heavy labor. Kermorvan's plan, therefore, was this, that while the main body of the force guarded fleet and shore, a swift band of such as were fittest should at once ride inland and seek the southland cities of Caris. This, he informed them, meeting all protest with a chilly gleam in his eye, he would himself lead. Elof would go with them as scout and courier. But none of this we may safely begin, he added grimly, till our third and most urgent problem is solved. What we do about our obliging escort out there." He gestured over his shoulder to the gaggle of black ships. "Chances are that'll be resolving itself any time now," remarked Rock cheerfully. "One of the buggers is rowing this way." There was a general rush to the side, but it was clear the newcomer meant no attack. There was something hesitant in the manner in which it hove to a discreet length from the Corentin and hailed for a parley. Elof was there when its boat drew under the warship's lee, and the chieftain of the Ravens climbed on board. He was grim of face, and there was fresh blood among the many stains on his mantle, but he saluted Kermorvan with respect, and Elof with awe. "No man fares best alone," he began, without preamble. "To gladden the eye of Raven, we set a spear between us and the other clans of the Ikea Washya, and defied the woman of the ice. Now we think we will gladden Raven's eye further if we join those others who follow him." Kermorvan's angry gesture silenced the outbursts of disbelief that arose all around, but the chieftain folded his arms and said no more. Kermorvan pushed his long hair back from his forehead and regarded him steadily a while before he answered. "You did what was honorable," he answered at last, very calmly, "and we take notice of it. We should have had hard fighting, for all our numbers. What it has cost you, we can guess. But your kin has never shown any love for ours, and there is an ocean of blood between us. When one shield wall joins with another, each man must trust his neighbor, or the wall is weaker than it was before. I cannot forget that you might be cunning traitors, preferring a sudden strike from within our ranks to an open clash of shield walls that must, in the end, cost all your lives. I do not say you were traitors, but I would be a fool not to think of it." The chieftain gave a contemptuous grunt, but said nothing. Kermorvan leaned back in his heavy chair. "We must know more. We also are honorable. Aid for aid we will return as generously as we may. But to have you join us is a longer step, and one we should both test first. How truly do you wish it? Is it not rather fear of Lohi's wrath that urges you on?" Kermorvan had taken care, Elof noticed, to speak in simple terms the Ekwesh would understand instantly, and to avoid offending him. And yet, he had accused him of fear. The chieftain bristled visibly, but controlling his temper and allowed himself a frigid nod. "Not to turn face from the unending is foolishness, and the ravens of Ikea Washa are not fools, King Oversea. Else should we chafe under her rule so long. We'd thought then, Raven sleeps, or Raven is weak, because he has no moving mountains, no warriors, no beasts, no sights or sendings, save, some say, himself. So we think, to serve well, we can do no better. Now we see this may not be so. There are other ways. That you serve him, and yet are not his slaves. That you have power to wield as he shows you, and yet is your own." The black eyes glittered as cold as Kermorvan's own, and the stolid face grinned with sudden, savage vitality. "To fight the hunter as you did, Steel Shaman. Aye, Would I had done that deed! She was wise not to send the ravens to fight in your land, but keep us to this, whose folk are rotten in their heart, and strive among themselves. We saw you, we knew the time had come. So, King Ovasi, our wish to join your force is true, not a turning of face. If he follows you, we shall also, in all you command. Elof felt intensely uncomfortable. You make too much of me, he said. The king over sea is a man to follow indeed. A terrible warrior, but wise also in the ways of peace. Look rather to him. Kermorven smiled wryly. Whatever the truth of this, I begin to understand your wish, and to believe you. But it is not something that can be decided in a moment. For one, are all your clan of the same mind? There are many yet in our own land. Here, there are many still ashore, some 40 ships or more. Them also we put in peril. But of those here at sea, all who remain are of the same mind. All who remain. A few were foolish, or face-turners, but have no concern. No ship is weaker save by a hand count, and the clan is stronger without them. He touched the bloodstain on his mantle. They served us for luck offerings. Then hear me, said Kermorven into the ensuing silence, as they pictured in their minds what bloody moments had passed upon those still ships. For now you find it well to join us, and I should be glad to welcome such powerful fighters under the Raven and Sun. But much of what we command might chafe upon you. We do not offer lives, for one thing, and you may not be so glad when the day comes that you must strike against your own kin. He paused, and the chieftain nodded curtly again. Very well, then. Against all this, and treason, we must guard. Our welcome is hard, but the times admit no better. You and yours must live and act only as we direct, till such time as we hold you proven. The chieftain said nothing, but made no move. But a strong pulse beat visibly at his jaw, and a stony pride was in his eyes. Abruptly, Kermorven surged to his feet, towering over him and all others on deck, and whipped from his belt his gray-gold sword. This, the master smith Elof Valantor, made me in the forges of the mountain folk. Say, will you swear fealty and obedience on it? For else upon its edge you dwell, and it has never yet been blunted. Speak now, or be gone. I will have everything, or nothing. For a long moment, the old man gazed at him. Then, with a sigh, he seemed to collapse like a punctured bladder. He bowed his head and fell to his knees and beat his forehead upon the planking. As you wish it, King over the sea. We are your hounds, and at heel we follow. In truth, as he explained readily enough afterwards, he had expected no less. It was agreed, among lesser precautions, that his ships should moor well apart, his men camp ashore in small groups under guard, in return for which they would both receive and help to gather supplies, chiefly fish, and that in battle by land or sea they would be set in a place where they might prove themselves at once. To this the chieftain assented, adding with a cold twinkle in his eyes, "But hurry the battle, lord, for we are not mild folk to sit idle at the doors of our tents. We breathe honor as the air." "Battle and honor you shall have soon enough," said Kermorven, "for now nothing hinders the searching party. See that it is made ready, for it departs within this very hour." In his place he left Ilse, as was his wont at home, but to aid her he commanded Rock as marshal of the fleet, much to his astonishment and disgust. "For you know the land, and are a man of hard counsel, well suited to such a rank, and," he added in a lower voice with a wry smile, "that is a thing you have achieved yourself. It is no accident of birth, like smithcraft, or, for that matter, kingship, and that Marja will not forget." Rock snorted. To his vast chagrin, or so he gave out, Marja, instead of finding someone else, had waited out his 9 years' absence quite faithfully, leaving him no honorable alternative but to cleave to her. In truth, she obviously suited him much better than he pretended, for the years had settled him. Only the matter of standing had rankled between them. Now Kermorven had more than made that up, and chosen so vital a time that none would claim he favored Rock from friendship alone. Certainly, Elof was glad that 2 such solid natures were left in charge, as he and Kermorven led their few squadrons of horsemen up the steep defiles above the landing site. It would not do to allow the Eqwesh to stage a surprise attack from the sea and destroy the ships. The landing could be penned in then, and left to starve with no way of escape. As they passed above the crest of the hills, Kermorven called to Elof, and together they left the column and rode up to the summit. Clinging to his saddle, Elof was too exhausted to speak when they reached the top, but he was able to seize Kermorven's arm and point. There, barely distinguishable from the hill crests atop that gray horizon, was the distant shape of the gate tower. No dragon coils crowned it now, no great head lifted towards the lowering overcast, yet its aura of menace seemed undiminished. "I feel it too," muttered Kermorven. "Once so great, yet what has it become?" "What has all this land become?" countered Elof harshly. "We linger from finding out, and night comes early. Would there were more sun." The 2 friends looked at one another, struck by the same thought. Then they looked upward at the lowering clouds, already tinged with red by the low sunbeams. "It can't be!" exclaimed Elof. "Not already!" But as the sun sank in a riot of hues, scarlet and peach and glaring dark gold, mantled over all in black, Elof took wing once more. When he returned, his hair seemed strangely faded, his wings grayed, till he clapped them together and blew a rich dust of pumice about the company. "On every hand the fire mountains belched smoke and ash," he reported. "They look like pillars upholding this canopy, as, in a sense, they are. The wild lands are still thick with snow. The Esquienes is well nigh frozen in its upper reaches, the rest awash with ice. In early summer, the attack has begun. What of the Ekwesh? Rasped Kermorven. Or any force of Lohis? Did you see anything of them? I saw something here on the southern bank, no more than 3 or 4 leagues hence. I could not get close enough before the light failed, but it looked to me like a great encampment around a town. A siege or a muster? Elof shrugged. Either. I said I could not see. And there were a few small flickers along the northern shore. Fires of picket camps, perhaps? Ekwesh, if so. Those lands have been long deserted. Nothing more, and hours, but it was cold up there. The ice rides the upper airs now. Kermorven looked grave, but he helped Elof unbuckle his harness. Come, warm yourself by the ovens, then. We dare not build open fires in this bare place. We must get away from it soon, even if that means pressing on through the night. To nobody's surprise, it did. The cold grew fierce enough to discourage even the weariest from thoughts of sleep. The danger of never waking was too great. The earth rang flinty beneath the hooves of their mounts. Their breath burned in their nostrils and steamed out in great clouds. Only a few stars glinted through the suffocating cloak of the upper airs, like the spear points of a night assault. The moon, when it rose, shone a few pale beams through the ragged cloud, but the frost-bound land glinted enough to give them light to ride by. They cantered on like a column of dark-cloaked ghosts, and made good speed. Near dawn they were already on the southern slopes of the hills, encamped beneath a stand of dead cork-bark oaks, winter's victims, and were grateful to snatch a few hours' sleep beneath the writhing sun. Then fire was kindled, and Elof lifted once more into the air, climbing so high that to any casual eye he must be mistaken for a bird. But he knew well that among his foes there were eyes less casual, eyes of freezing blue, eyes of blazing green, and he held Gorthar ready at his belt, the gauntlet on his arm. Only his heart felt unready to face either. The land swept by beneath him as if his wing beats brushed it away. There was little warmth in the light, but enough to keep him aloft for many leagues yet, and the warm south wind that had brought them ashore contended with the cold flow down from the north. Their conflict sped him swiftly eastward toward the town he had glimpsed. He could remember the name of only one fortified town in this region, Torvalen, a holding whose lords had been a particular thorn in Netheid's side. It did not augur well. Like many of their northern cousins, they might have sought to compact with the Ekwesh. Again and again, he wondered what he had done in slaying Nethaid. The ruthlessness that had dogged him all through his life, that Corentin in naming him had hung around his neck. Had it betrayed him as before, and perhaps the whole world with it? All the bitter self-disgust of old came welling up in his throat. All the old ghosts flew mockingly beside him. What was he? Who was he, that he should do such things, bear such burdens? He had never really known. But long before he reached his goal, he saw a change that drove the phantoms of the past from his waking mind. That dark smudge in the lands around had changed shape, grown longer to the west, like some amorphous creature stretching out an arm of its substance. And there was something moving among the river ice. Puzzled, he went gliding down towards it. They had agreed that while he was scouting, Kermorven should not wait, but continue his drive eastward. Time was too short to waste. Elof could find them on the move easily enough, and it would shorten his journey back. So it was that he came upon the column as it was making its way across the southward slopes, and seen for the first time the Vale of Caris laid out before it. So intent were they all, even Kermorven, on the sight of this, their ancestral homeland, and the focus of all their legends and tales, that they were near panic as Elof came down among them, with men shouting and horses milling and rearing, ready to bolt. "I might have been another dragon," grinned Elof breathlessly, as the alarm settled. "Could have settled on your wrist like a falcon." "You could hardly have caused more of a row," said Kermorven irritably. Then he grinned ruefully. "Oh, very well, I admit it. I was too struck by the sight to set a proper watch kept. What news, then, with such haste? Do you bring a band of reavers down on us?" "Far from it. There'd better be none this side of the great river if they value their hides. There's a host of Caris on the march." Kermorven seized him by the arm. "You're sure?" "Of course. All straggling out along the high roads, with cogs plying back and forth on the river. They're breaking channels in the ice as they go. I saw banners and standards I've seen before. On my second pass, I stooped low enough to see the very shade of their faces, and nearly caused a riot." "Evidently a habit of yours. But small wonder, when the tale of Netheid's death must now be well known. As well they did not singe your plumes with this smith's fire of yours." Elof frowned. "They hardly looked able. That's no orderly force, from the glimpse I got. Save for a few under the banners of lords, and even the banners are ragged. The rest, straggling off in any order. A rabble army. No colors, armor smirched and gear fouled, as if they fought through mires and slept in them too. After fierce winter, flooding thaw," mused Kermorven, quoting an old piece of weather lore. "Even a miserable failed thaw such as this. Very likely they have. But they cannot hope to meet the Ekwesh thus, not in their full array of battle, with Loki to general them. Still, their coming would explain why she has not been free to strike at us across the land. I guess that the sooner we join them, the better." 3 days later, when Kermorven's force came trotting out of the hills above the march, it became clear that Elof's surmise had been right. The army was at its noonday rest, straggling out across the land like a ragged scar, stretching far into the distance. Only here and there was there any trace of order. Yet when the first sounds of hooves reached the flanking columns, they saw sentinels enough spring to their feet, and if the weapons in their hands glinted dully, still they were held steady, and no man turned. Horns sounded, and the whole long line erupted. The country seethed like an ant's nest. Kermorven exclaimed in astonishment as he saw it. "There must be tens of thousands here." "Such is the might of Caris," said Elof quietly. "Each campaign Netheid could raise a force thrice the size of ours, and still leave his lord some garrison. Did I not tell you?" "You did, and I believed you. But it is another matter to see it before us. As well we make ourselves known ere it rolls over us. He gestured to the riders to form up, and led them off downhill at a brisk canter, their mail and weapons jingling merrily across the breeze. "Now, sound your horns," he ordered, "and standard-bearer, unfurl that banner." The hubbub had begun to die down, as the sentries realized this was only a small party, and saw their skins pale, and Kermorvan's long bronze hair blowing in the breeze. But when the silver cavalry horns split the air, and the long black pennon broke out and floated over the tossing crests of the helms, the melee broke out anew, men shading their eyes and pointing, gesturing furiously at the design of the raven and the sun on the banner. For this was the emblem of the Ysmerian kings, that had not flown in this land for 3 generations, and had scarcely been seen above the heads of warriors for centuries before that. At the very margins of the army, Kermorvan wheeled his horsemen and brought them. Still in their tight formation, cantering cheerfully along the ranks. He kept a careful eye on Elof, who was having some difficulty staying in his saddle, let alone holding the line. But it did not stop either of them from noting how men who seemed sunk in weariness and filth, who looked up with disheartened desperation on their faces, sprang up with astonishment at the sight of this trim band of horsemen, and the banner they bore. Kermorvan at their head was a sight in himself, clad in the grim black mail coat of his fathers, but with a cloak of rich furs streaming out behind, and the raven crest damascened on his breastplate, glittering even in that sullen light. He wore no helm, his blowing hair serving him for crest and crown, and above that stern and ageless face, it made him look every inch a king. He reined in when he came to the first of the banners in the fan, and bade his horns sound once more. Men came thronging around him, but though he held up a hand to them, he was obviously looking for some man, such as the one who came riding up through the crowd on a tall chestnut warhorse. A burly, balding man in a stained black tunic, set at the breast with the same red shield as upon the banner, patterned with gold mascles, a heavy broadsword with an intricate cage hilt swung at his side, and his hand was never far from it as he cursed the common kerns out of his way. "And who in the name of Verya do you think you are, riding in under that banner?" he demanded in a sibilant southern drawl. Kermorvan smiled, and shaping his words as Elof had taught him, he replied, "I had best answer to the commander of this army, whom I seek. Are you he, or will you take me to him?" "Commander!" glared the burly nobleman, his short beard bristling. "Where have you sprung from? Fallen from yesterday's rain? You don't think this mob can boast a commander, do you? We're long past such things. We're bound to fight, man, and that's about the best we can manage. If you've a mind to die beside us, why then, muck in, and welcome to you. No politeness needed, I do assure you. Needn't even answer your bloody name." "But I will nonetheless." Kermorvan's cold eyes sparkled. "I will join you gladly, but I have no mind to die quite yet. I am the Lord Karen Kermorvan of Morven, King of Morvenhall, heir of the line of the Ysmerian, Lord of all the children of Caris in the land of High Bracehall, far across the oceans. We have heard of your need, and brought such force as we can to your aid. Even now our fleet disembarks upon the coast, and though we have brought but half your number, we are fresh and hardened, and our hearts are in the trim, for we also have faced the ice and the Equesh in our lands, and though it has cost us dearly, we have beaten them back. The big man looked at him blankly. You're kin of ours from over sea, of Ysmerian blood, and you've landed. He sounded about to choke. Some 10,000 men to help us. 10,000 fighting men. Kermorven nodded. And well armed, though a few are also smiths, such as my court master-smith here. The Baron glanced at Elof. Then his eyes bulged, and he clapped hand to sword with such violence his horse almost reared under him. You're the sorcerer who slew Nithid. Elof nodded calmly. As I promised him, for good cause. And ere he died, I promised him I would bring his folk a worthier figure of a king. So, it was true what you said, muttered the Baron. I was at court when you came. Aye, you had cause. But, Ysmerian. He glanced at Kermorven from keen, dark eyes, then anxiously around at the throng of men who were pressing in, hanging on every word. He has the look of it. Gentles, you had better come with me. The lords must hear of this. He swung the heavy horse about, beckoning them to follow him, and curdled the air as he sought to clear a way through the press. But others have heard of it first, thought Elof, looking down on faces dulled and haggard, catching new life from a spark of hope. Then, as the column wheeled to follow the Baron, he caught his friend's eye, and was startled by the twinkle in it, wintry but unmistakable. It was too easy to forget that Kermorven, though almost painfully honest and honorable in himself, had a king's upbringing, and kingship in his blood. It made him, among other things, extremely adept at getting his own way. He had deliberately attracted the attention of large numbers of common soldiers before announcing himself and his purpose. He had seized the chance to do so in their hearing, and drive home the message that Ice and Equesh could be beaten, or had he very gently maneuvered the Baron into giving him it? Elof had warned him of the squabbles and jealousies he must expect among the lords of Caris, and he had passed them by before they even knew it. So it was that while the loose alliance of nobles who had strung together this last desperate army of Caris were welcoming Kermorven effusively, and at the same time striving either to put him in his place, or, as they got the measure of him, to win some personal alliance with him, the word was spreading through the army outside, like sparks spreading before a forest fire. Arid for confirmation they had Kermorven's horsemen, men of Morvenhall and of Kerbrahane, together in amity, common men like themselves, but equipped and armed better than most of the lords. They were only too ready to tell tales of Kermorven's defeat of the Mastersmith in the Westlands, of his journey east and liberation of Morvanik from its oppressors, of how he had rescued the besieged folk of Nordney and Kerbrahane, and united them into a strong and peaceful eastern kingdom, all in the short space of 17 years, and all, they were careful to add, when he was no more than 44 years old himself, and could, if he lasted the long span of his line, look to another 40 or 50 active years. Before the lords had spent more than an hour or two in talk, they were astonished to hear a growing murmur outside their great tent, lively but restive, and sent out to see what it was about. When answer was returned that the soldiers wished to see the king, they looked at one another in dawning dismay, and some in sharp displeasure. Elof, who had been observing their maneuvering with amusement, tempered with disgust, grew tense, and made sure that Gorthar was to hand. But Kermorven looked blandly astonished, and sat at ease where he was. "King!" barked one of the more piratical lords from the northern shore. "The only king here's from a far land, and doesn't mean to go poking his nose into the matters of Caris. Tell that to the swine." He had forgotten that he was not within the thick walls of his tower, now reduced by the Eqwesh, nor surrounded by his own unquestioning peasantry as of old. The ragged and desperate soldiers outside these walls of oiled cloth and leather were of a very different mood, and they heard him clearly. A loud rumble and hiss of anger, like a wave breaking on gravel, answered him at once, and his florid face grew pale. The others rounded on him in anger and panic. They were not evil men, thought Elof. They had at least had the wisdom to swallow their differences, the will and courage to muster this last force, to give a morsel of leadership where it was needed. Nor were they battening on their followers, as some lords might have. Their gear was as grimy, their armor as rusty, their board as bare, their faces as gaunt and desperate as any of their men's. But it was obviously their power they were most concerned about, and the independence they had looked forward to since Nethaid's death. Even before his forefathers usurped the kingship, the lords of this land had lost any respect for it, or any idea that they might benefit under a central rule. Or the common folk either. It was not impossible that they cared for them, in their own way. Now, though, they were in for a shock. Outside, the murmur of the crowd was rising, growing louder and more rhythmical, becoming a chant there was no mistaking. "The king, the king, show us the king, we'll see the king, we want the king, bring out our king." "Outrageous!" blared the young king of Caerullion, the great city in the south. "Get out there and silence them." "Who are you talking to?" growled an older and poorer lord. "Go silence 'em yourself, puppy. They'll rend you limb from limb. They've had a scent of something they want, and woe betide any of us dares tell 'em they can't have it." There was a long silence while the lords assembled digested this unpleasant truth, and then, for the first time, many pairs of hostile eyes lit upon Kermorven. "You must tell them, then," said Iroak, who had been Nethaid's steward. "See to them that you have come to help, and have no other ambitions. That being a stranger, you must naturally submit to our command." He faltered. Kermorven's lean features had hardly changed, but there was a faint and alarming smile on his lips. "Must I?" He spread his hands, as the faces grew downright menacing. Speak to them so, I mean. They relaxed a little, and so did Elof. He had Gorthar's hilt in his right hand, the weight of the long trestle table in his left, ready to hurl it in their faces if they sprang. But Kermorvan's smile hardened, and became a wry and angry grimace. My lords, consider. What you ask me to say would be justified if there were some solid captaincy here, some leader or leaders fit to direct such a force as this in so crucial a campaign. But what do I find? What do you find, if you look honestly at yourselves? You are so strained with suppressing your rivalries that you can barely agree which direction to march in. And though you are all capable warriors, not one among you has ever held such a command as this. I know that because I have listened to your talk, and because Nethade would never have risked giving an underling such power. Speak to my lords when you meet them, and you may hear a different tale. But that is not now at issue. What is captaincy. Look upon me, my lords. You know little of me, save what I have told you. But I think that simply not being one of you, not being caught up in your ancient strife, would be a great asset in a leader. However, I can offer you more. I was born to war. I have fought by land and sea, as penniless wanderer, as common sailor, as leader of half-armed mobs, and marshal of great armies. I have fought men and monsters. I have raised my sword against the very walls of winter themselves, and I have not been defeated. In the gloomy light of the tent, his pale face seemed gray and stony, implacable, resolute. I ask you, am I not better suited to command than any of you, let alone your ramshackle confederacy? Ask yourselves, where lies your greatest chance to save your land, your estates, your power that you cherish so much? I do not say there is much hope. This land has been let slip far, and perhaps it must fall further yet, ere it can be cleansed. But I urge you, do not let it slip away altogether, to gratify your own resentments. Do not bury your good sense beneath stale rivalries of rank and lineage. But if you must, what of mine? I am the last of the Ismarian, and descended from a line which, had it not balked at kin strife, could have held the kingship of Caris more rightfully than the one that did. I could step out of this tent and assert my ancient right. And dare you think it would not be upheld? The cold eyes blazed, the calm voice thundered. The assembled lords gave back, astonished. They had seen Nethade in his wrath, but never this mood of stone and centuries that had descended upon Kermorvan in his righteous anger. My lords, he said, amid a sudden hush outside, I will make no such claim unless you force me, unless there is no other way to stop you casting away the lives of your followers and mine. to stop you ruining the last hope of this desperate land, and perhaps of the whole living world, with your selfish follies and distrusts. I will lead you now, if you will it, as war leader only. As to kingship, let that rest until there's a land to be king of once more. Then we shall see. Indeed, and by then you'll have your claws well fixed in the throne anyway, grunted a sour-faced southern lord. Kermorvan's look was bleak, but unoffended. You seem very certain that I would want it. That left them silent with confusion and suspicion blended. To them, Caris was the world. They knew well enough that Kermorvan had his own land, his own realm, but could hardly bring themselves to credit that he might prefer it. Anyway, what's in the name? Added the Baron of the Red Shield. Whatever we called any leader we choose. Warlord, Overlord, Marshal of the Field. They'll call him king. They trust kings. They don't trust us. And I don't blame them one blind bit. The lords were drawing breath to turn on him next when Kermorvan's voice, pitched to carry to the outside, curled around them like the fine tip of a lash. I came this great distance to strike at the ice, my lords. That is all. And with you or without you, fight I shall. If I cannot wring some sense from you, shall I ask your men? I do not think they will refuse me. Others have not. We are not without other allies. Elof watched warily as Kermorvan told them just who they were and how they had come to serve beneath the Raven banner, expecting a great outburst. But when he had done there was only silence, broken at last by the burly Baron. "Ich wish," he drawled thoughtfully, 30 shiploads, which is to say some 4,000 of 'em. And the dragon. Well, gentles, to whom shall fall the honor of proclaiming our new warlord? It won't last, you know, warned Elof as he and Kermorvan rode out in the van of the ragged army towards the northern flanks of the hills they had passed through. This sudden meekness of theirs. You've daunted them well for now, yes. But if things go ill, even briefly, or the moment the fighting's done. Kermorvan smiled. I know. But that moment is a fair step into the future, and I am preparing for it. Now, do you don your wings, for you must take word to Rock and Ills at once. Well, there is light. Our two forces must move swiftly to unite. March night and day if need be. If Lohi realizes we have met, let alone made alliance, she will hurl everything she can between us. So go now. Guide them to the tryst. We shall be hurrying on your heels. It was 4 days later that the two armies met. It could scarcely have been sooner. The place appointed was a shallow cleft in the hills above the southern cliffs of the Vale, just beyond the angle where the Yeskiennis narrowed sharply, more or less opposite where Elof and Rock had first looked out over the great valley. Its surrounding hills, though they were no protection from the icy north wind, screened it well from the sight of the distant gate. The mood in both armies was one of rejoicing at the finding of kin long lost, and it made mingling them an easier task. When the lords and captains of both armies came together, united by the common demands of commanding so great a body of men, and of establishing a new battle order, the soldiers soon followed their example, and by morning Kermorven commanded a reasonably unified army. But it was not without its problems. If Kermorven's force had found their rations meager before, when they saw the plight of their fellows, they portioned them gladly. That created great goodwill, but something of a problem.
"It'll leave us little enough to fall back on,"
was Rock's verdict.
"But then if this goes ill, there'll be nowhere to fall back to, will there?"
So it came about that the men of Caris went on to their war somewhat strengthened, and in many cases armed anew with spare weapons from the store Elof and his mastersmiths had built up. Shields alone were denied them, though the fleet had brought a great store of light metal shields, tall curved rectangles large enough to shelter the whole body. But it appeared that these were of some special kind, which only trained men could use properly, and Kermorven had forbidden their being given away. This did create some resentment, but it was a small enough point, passed over easily at the glad meeting of the armies. More troublesome was the strong presence in the fleet of Nordni men with the same copper skin as the Eqwesh. Many Caris men met them with lively and vocal distrust and scorn, and as the Northerners were not given to suffering insult mildly, it took all of Kermorven's authority to quell the resulting dissension. The wiser Caris men accepted them then, at least when they found they talked and behaved much like their own Northerners. The rest soon found it politic to keep their resentment silent. Only the ravens stood apart from the gathering, eating the mass of fish they had caught and smoked while Kermorven was away, and loathed to share. Most men were glad of that, for they remained a fell and uncanny folk, and there was hardly a man there of either camp who had not suffered some loss at the hands of their fellows, whether of home or kinsfolk of their or his own blood. Among the Caris men, in particular, there was great ill feeling against them, but it was mitigated by the belief that their desertion was a potent omen. Also, Kermorven had put Elof, who spoke their tongue best, in charge of them, to see that they neither offered nor suffered any treachery, and every man who was too much in awe of him to risk anything. Kermorven lingered only long enough at that camp to send out scouts, Elof among them, and plot what they found out onto the maps the nobles brought him. Then, shortly before dawn on a day of mist and rain, a whisper ran through the camp that was more thrilling than any trumpet or drum. The new king had commanded silence, and all his subjects, old and new, were already given to heed him. In a pale half-light, with no fanfare save the muted thunder of their own bustle and tread, the last army of men formed up and marched away to do battle with the ancient powers of the world. All right, guys, we made it through Chapter 10. Yay! Which means next week, Chapter 11, and then Chapter 12. Getting close to the end here. Happy days. Tuna, how are you tonight? So, a little bit shorter chapter than some of the others have been, but hey, we'll take it, as occasionally it must be. So, as always, thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer is a gift of your time, and I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for the 2 hours of the chapter. I'll be back again tomorrow. Tomorrow is Kingmaker, Pathfinder campaign on Foundry VTT. I might be a little bit late for it. I'm not 100% certain. I have a volunteer event going on beforehand, teaching some financial literacy to a group of intellectually challenged individuals. So it's supposed to start at 5, so it should be done at 6, but some of those things, sometimes run over. But I would anticipate being here on time. And then, of course, Thursday will be Stompy Mech Night. Hope you guys all have yourselves a wonderful evening. Good. I'm glad to hear it, Tuna. Glad to hear that you're doing well and enjoying the book. Both wonderful, wonderful things. Hope you guys have yourselves a wonderful evening and a fantastic rest of your Tuesday and a fantastic Wednesday until hopefully I see you guys all tomorrow. Good night, all.